Welcome to Time Capsule, Modern Genealogy, Legacy, and AI, the podcast where we explore family history, preservation, genealogy, DNA, artificial intelligence, and the stories that connect generations. I'm your host, Barbara Beauregard, professional genealogist, author, educator, and creator of the Time Capsule Method. Each week, I share practical genealogy strategies, preservation tips, and real life stories to help you discover, preserve, and pass along your family's legacy. Whether you're just beginning your family history journey or you've been researching for decades, I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy this podcast, I'd appreciate it if you'd follow the show, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves family history. Every new listener helps preserve more stories for future generations. Now let's begin. Today's episode is a little different. Most weeks, I teach a genealogy method, explain a DNA concept, or talk about preserving your family history. But today, I'd like to tell you a story. Not just any story, but a real research case that has stayed with me over the years. It's a story about adoption, about patience, about DNA, about traditional genealogy, about ethics, and ultimately about how every piece of evidence matters. I've changed the names of the people involved to protect their privacy, but every event I'll describe really happened. When people hear about DNA testing, they often think that once the results come in, the answers simply appear. The reality is usually very different. DNA opens the door, genealogy walks through it, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes with twists you never expected. Today's story is one of those twists. It begins with one man searching for answers. It ends with two sisters and a hidden truth. Imagine spending your entire life wondering where you came from. You know you're adopted. You know someone made the difficult decision to place you with another family. You grow up surrounded by love. You appreciate your adoptive parents. But deep inside, questions remain. Who do I look like? Where did my smile come from? Who inherited my laugh? Do I have brothers, sisters, medical conditions I should know about? For many adoptees, those questions never completely disappear. That's exactly where this story begins. Several years ago, a gentleman I'll call Michael contacted me. Michael was in his mid-60s. He had always known he had been adopted. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to replace the family who raised him. He simply wanted to understand the first chapter of his life. Michael had been born in Vermont during the 1950s. Shortly after his birth, he was placed in an orphanage. Eventually, he was adopted by a loving family in neighboring New Hampshire. He grew up knowing he was adopted, but like many adoptees born during that time, his original birth records were sealed. There wasn't an easy way to simply request his birth certificate and learn the names of his biological parents. For decades, the trail ended there. Then something happened that has changed family history forever. Consumer DNA testing became available. Like millions of other people, Michael decided to take a DNA test. He mailed off his sample, waited several weeks, and then the results arrived. For many people, the first thing they see is a long list of distant cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, people they've never heard of. But Michael's results were very different. Near the top of his match list was someone sharing more than 1,400 centimorgans of DNA with him. Now, if you're new to DNA, let me explain why that number immediately caught my attention. Centimorgans, often shortened to cm, measure how much DNA two people share. The larger the number, the closer the relationship. A match of over 1,400 centimorgans isn't some distant cousin you might have shared a great great grandparent with. It's close family, very close. When I saw that number, I knew we weren't looking at a distant branch of the family tree. We were standing near the trunk. Whenever I see a match over 1,000 centimorgans, I know I'm no longer looking at distant cousins. At that level, we're talking about grandparents, aunts, uncles, half siblings, nieces, nephews, close family. That's why my attention immediately shifted from who could this be to how does this person fit into the immediate family. Michael reached out to this match, the gentleman responded. Within a short time, Michael learned something extraordinary. The man wasn't just related, he was his biological father's brother, his uncle. Imagine carrying questions for more than 60 years, and then, within a matter of days, discovering your biological father's identity. That doesn't happen very often. His father's name was Joseph Ward. Joseph had been a young Air Force serviceman stationed in Vermont during the early 1950s. While there, he met a young woman. They developed a relationship. She became pregnant. Joseph wanted to marry her, but she declined. When his military assignment ended, Joseph returned home to California. Eventually, he married his high school sweetheart. Together, they raised 3 sons. Michael also learned something bittersweet. His biological father had passed away in 1998 following complications from open heart surgery. So while Michael would never have the opportunity to meet him, he finally knew who he was. Sometimes, even that knowledge brings peace. Many people might think the story ended there. After all, Michael had found his father, case closed. But genealogy rarely works that way. One answer almost always leads to another question. For Michael, the biggest question still remained: who was his biological mother? Unlike his father's family, there was no close DNA match waiting to introduce itself, no uncle, no aunt, no obvious answer. This was where the detective work really began. As we continued examining Michael's DNA results, another significant match appeared. Me, Michael and I shared approximately 650 centimorgans of DNA. Again, that's not a small amount. That placed us somewhere within the range of a first cousin or first cousin once removed. Immediately I knew one thing: we were related through my father's side of the family. When I began studying our shared DNA matches, everything consistently pointed back to one side of my family tree. That's an important lesson for anyone working with DNA. Sometimes DNA doesn't tell you exactly who someone is. Instead, it tells you where to look. Think of it this way. Imagine someone tells you your lost relative lives somewhere in North Carolina. That's helpful, but North Carolina is a big place. Now imagine they narrow it down to Henderson County. Much better. Then Hendersonville. Now you're getting close. DNA often works the same way. It narrows your search, but it doesn't always point directly to one individual. That's exactly what happened here. Not the person. As I continued analyzing our shared matches, one family branch stood out clearly. Everything pointed there. That was exciting. But there was also a problem. That branch contained several daughters who could potentially be Michael's mother. DNA had identified the correct branch. Traditional genealogy now had to identify the correct person. This is one of the biggest misconceptions I hear about DNA testing. People sometimes believe DNA replaces genealogy. It doesn't. DNA and genealogy are partners. DNA asks the questions. Traditional records help answer them. Without both, you're often left with possibilities instead of proof. At this point, it would have been very easy to jump to conclusions. One woman may have seemed more likely simply because of her age, another because she lived nearby, another because someone in the family vaguely remembered hearing a rumor decades earlier. But good genealogists don't solve mysteries with assumptions, we solve them with evidence. So before I compared another DNA match, I did something that I recommend every genealogist do. I built a candidate list. Instead of asking, "Who do I think it is?" I asked, "Who could it possibly be?" Those are very different questions. I started gathering every piece of information I could find. How old was each woman in 1954? Was she of childbearing age? Where was she living? Was she married, single? Did newspaper announcements mention pregnancies? Did census records, city directories, or other documents place her somewhere else during that time? Were there documented births that would leave little room for another pregnancy? One by one, the evidence began speaking. Some women were simply too young, others were too old. Some lived outside Vermont, others had documented life events that ruled them out completely. Every elimination mattered because in genealogy, proving someone isn't the right person is just as valuable as proving someone is. Gradually, the list became shorter, smaller, more focused, until only 3 women remained: 3 sisters, 3 possible mothers, 3 lives that, on paper, all seemed possible. And that's where today's story reaches its first turning point. Because narrowing the search to 3 sisters wasn't the end of the investigation, it was actually the beginning of the hardest part. At this point, the investigation became even more challenging. Finding the correct family branch was an important milestone, and the evidence had narrowed our search to 3 sisters. That may sound like tremendous progress, and it was, but I wasn't interested in finding the most likely mother. I wanted to identify the correct mother. In genealogy, those are 2 very different things. Too often, researchers stop when they find someone who seems to fit. They begin attaching names to family trees based on assumptions instead of evidence. I've learned over the years that assumptions can send you down the wrong path very quickly. Instead, I wanted the evidence to tell the story, so I returned to the DNA. DNA isn't just about finding matches, it's about understanding how those matches fit together. Every relationship has an expected range of shared DNA, not an exact number, but a range. I began studying the descendants of each of the remaining sisters. I compared Michael's shared centimorgan amounts with each person. Then I asked myself an important question. If this woman were Michael's biological mother, what should I expect these numbers to look like? That question guided everything. One sister's descendants consistently shared far less DNA than they should have. The numbers simply didn't support the relationship we would expect. Now, low DNA alone doesn't always eliminate someone. DNA inheritance is random, but when several pieces of evidence point in the same direction, that's when confidence begins to grow. Eventually, I became comfortable eliminating one of the sisters. Now there were only 2 women, 1 family branch, 1 hidden truth. This is the point where many people become frustrated. Michael certainly did. After all, we'd invested hours studying records, we'd analyzed DNA, we had reduced an entire family tree to just 2 possible women. Surely there had to be one more record, one more newspaper, one more clue, but there wasn't. Sometimes genealogy reaches a temporary stopping point, not because you've done something wrong, but because the evidence simply doesn't exist yet. That can be one of the hardest lessons for researchers to accept. Genealogy isn't always about searching harder. Sometimes it's about waiting patiently for new evidence to appear. I explained the situation to Michael. I told him there were really 3 options. The first option was to contact members of both families and ask someone to take a DNA test. That, however, would require explaining why. Imagine receiving a message from a complete stranger saying, "I think your mother or your aunt may have had a child she placed for adoption 70 years ago. Would you take a DNA test? That's not an easy conversation. The second option was to accept that one of those two sisters was almost certainly his biological mother and leave the mystery there. Some people choose that path. There is nothing wrong with it. The third option was simply to wait for someone from one of those families to take a DNA test on their own. Michael looked at me and said, "I'll wait." So we waited. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing. No new matches, no breakthroughs, no new clues. Life continued. Michael went about his daily routine. I continued helping other clients, but every so often I'd log in just to see if anything had changed. Anyone who works with DNA long enough knows this feeling. You never know when the next piece of the puzzle will appear. Sometimes it's tomorrow, sometimes it's 5 years from now. In this case, it was almost one full year. One day, there it was, a brand new DNA match. I immediately noticed the shared DNA amount, 1,179 centimorgans. That number instantly caught my attention. It was exactly the kind of close relationship we'd been hoping for. Not proof by itself, but incredibly strong evidence. This individual, whom I'll call Jonathan, was the grandson of one of the two remaining sisters. When I saw that relationship, my heart skipped a beat. This was the opportunity we'd been waiting for. I contacted Jonathan and explained that a very close DNA match had appeared. Naturally, he was surprised. In fact, Ancestry estimated that Michael was Jonathan's half-uncle. Jonathan wanted to understand how that could possibly be true. So I suggested he and Michael begin talking directly. Sometimes it's better for families to have those conversations together. Jonathan spoke with his mother, whom I'll call Lisa. Neither of them had any idea where this was leading. At this point, no one had suggested that Michael might actually be Lisa's half-brother. As far as the family knew, their mother Betty had never mentioned having another child. There had been no stories, no rumors, no whispered conversations, nothing. I suggested that Lisa take a DNA test, even though Jonathan's results were already very convincing. Another close test would provide even stronger evidence. Everyone agreed. Then something happened that none of us could have planned. Lisa's mother, Betty, happened to live with Lisa and Jonathan. One day, she overheard them discussing a DNA test. Curious, Betty asked why Lisa wanted to test, not wanting to reveal the real reason until they understood the facts. Lisa smiled and said, "I'm just curious how much Native American ancestry we have." Betty thought that sounded interesting. Then she said something no one expected. "I'd like to take one too." Sometimes genealogy hands you a gift you never imagined. Without pressure, without confrontation, without accusation, the very person we'd been searching for volunteered to take the DNA test herself. None of us saw that coming. Several weeks later, the results arrived. There was no longer any doubt. Lisa's DNA confirmed the relationship. Betty's DNA confirmed it beyond question. After more than 60 years, Michael finally knew Betty was his biological mother. The search was over, or perhaps more accurately, one chapter had ended, another was just beginning. Many people assume that solving the mystery is the emotional climax. In reality, it wasn't. The most difficult part came afterward. Betty was now in her 90s. Her health was declining. Her family had never heard that she had given birth to a son. Imagine carrying that secret for more than 70 years. Whatever circumstances surrounded Michael's birth, they belonged to a very different time, a time when unwed mothers often faced overwhelming social pressure, a time when many women had few choices. Now we faced a question that no DNA test could answer. What should we do? Just because we discover the truth, does that automatically mean everyone should hear it immediately? Ethics matters. Compassion matters. Respect matters. Those conversations are every bit as important as the research itself. Jonathan, Lisa, her sisters, Michael, and I spent considerable time discussing the situation. There wasn't one obvious answer. There rarely is. Eventually, everyone agreed on a plan because Betty had never spoken about Michael throughout her life. They chose not to confront her directly. Instead, they introduced Michael as a family friend. That gave everyone an opportunity to spend time together naturally, to build relationships, to get to know one another, without forcing Betty to revisit painful memories she may not have wanted to discuss. Over time, Michael became part of the family. He attended gatherings. He got to know his biological relatives. Most importantly, he had the opportunity to know his mother, perhaps not in the way either of them imagined decades earlier, but with kindness, with dignity, and without causing unnecessary pain. To me, that was every bit as meaningful as solving the genealogy. This case reinforced several lessons I'll never forget. First, DNA is an extraordinary tool, but DNA rarely tells the whole story by itself. Traditional records, timelines, newspapers, family history, and careful reasoning are still essential. Second, possibility is not proof. Just because someone seems to fit doesn't mean they're the answer. We must be willing to eliminate candidates as carefully as we identify them. Third, patience is part of genealogy. Sometimes the answer doesn't arrive because you worked harder. Sometimes it arrives because someone else finally takes a DNA test. Finally, genealogy isn't just about discovering facts, it's about people. Every family has joys. Every family has heartaches. Every family has secrets. Our responsibility as genealogists is not simply to uncover those stories, it's to handle them with integrity. One of the guiding principles of the time capsule method is that we don't simply collect names and dates. We preserve lives, we preserve relationships, we preserve context, and when we uncover difficult stories, we preserve compassion as well. Family history isn't about judging the past, it's about understanding it. Every person in our family tree lived within the circumstances of their own time. When we approach those stories with empathy rather than judgment, we honor both the people who came before us and those who will one day inherit the stories we leave behind. Before we close, here are a few things I'd like you to remember from today's episode. DNA opens doors, but traditional genealogy helps walk through them. Build a candidate list before drawing conclusions. Eliminate possibilities using evidence, not assumptions. Don't become discouraged if your search reaches a temporary dead end. Sometimes the next clue simply hasn't appeared yet. Respect the living as much as you respect the historical record. Genealogy is about people, not just pedigrees. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Time Capsule, Modern Genealogy, Legacy, and AI. I hope Michael's story reminds you that some of the greatest discoveries in genealogy don't happen overnight. They come from careful research, patient observation, thoughtful reasoning, and a deep respect for the people whose lives we're privileged to study. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider following the podcast, leaving a review, or sharing it with a friend or fellow family historian. Your support helps preserve more stories and reach more people who are passionate about discovering their roots. In our next episode, we'll shift from discovering family stories to preserving them. We'll explore how to interview relatives before it's too late, where I'll share practical tips, meaningful questions to ask, and simple ways to capture memories before they're lost forever. Until next time, remember, every family has a story. Every story deserves to be preserved. And every story you save today becomes a gift for future generations. I'm Barbara Beauregard. Thank you for listening.